Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the stories. Number Dead Reckoning. The North Atlantic is a cruel mistress, and I've spent 40 years learning her moods. I know her rage in winter, her deceptive calm in summer, and every temperament in between. But nothing in those decades prepared me for what happened aboard the Serena May last October, an encounter that's left me questioning everything I once believed about life, death, and the thin veil between them. My name is Captain Thomas Blackwood. At 67, I should have been enjoying retirement, watching the sea from the safety of my coastal cottage in Maine. Instead, I found myself accepting one final commission, delivering the aging cargo vessel Serena May from Halifax to Liverpool before she was to be decommissioned and scrapped. A simple farewell voyage for both of us, two old warhorses making one last crossing. The Serena May was a relic built in the late 1970s, all utilitarian steel and practical design with none of the computerized systems of modern vessels. She had character, as we used to say. The shipping company had kept her running long past her prime, but economics finally caught up. Too expensive to retrofit, too inefficient to operate. Progress marches on, and the old must make way for the new. I'd captained her briefly in the mid-90s, a 2-year stint before moving to larger vessels. Those had been good years, with a solid crew and mostly favorable conditions. When the call came asking if I'd take her on her final journey, nostalgia got the better of me. One last voyage before we both retired from the sea forever. The owners were cutting corners. Instead of the usual 20-crew complement, they'd assigned just 12 men, the minimum needed to operate her safely. Most were strangers to me, hired hands with decent enough credentials, though none had served on the Serena May before. The exception was my first officer, Malcolm Reed, who'd been my second in command during my previous time aboard. He'd gone gray at the temples, but still had the same sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor I remembered. "Good to see you, Thomas," he said when we met at the Halifax dock. "Never thought I'd find myself back on this old tub." "Makes two of us," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "How long has it been?" 23 years since we sailed together," Malcolm said, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite place. "Time flies." We spent 2 days preparing for departure, checking systems, loading the modest cargo, and familiarizing the crew with the vessel's peculiarities. The Serena May had quirks, as all older ships do. Certain valves that needed extra coaxing, corridors that groaned with specific sounds in different weather, and a temperamental electrical system that required knowing which breakers to reset when particular circuits failed. The weather forecast was favorable for October, some rough patches expected mid-Atlantic, but nothing the old girl couldn't handle. We departed Halifax on schedule, the harbor growing small behind us as we set course for the open ocean. The first 3 days passed uneventfully. The crew was competent if not particularly friendly with one another. The usual camaraderie that develops on longer voyages seemed slow to form, but I attributed that to the temporary nature of our assignment. Why forge bonds when we'd all go our separate ways once we reached Liverpool? It was on the 4th night that I first noticed something amiss. I'd been asleep in my cabin when a sound woke me, voices in the corridor outside my door, speaking too quietly to make out words but with a distinct tone of urgency. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. Nobody should have been in that section of the ship at that hour except the night watch, who would have been on the bridge or in the engine room. I rose, pulled on my robe, and opened my door. The corridor was empty, but I could have sworn I heard footsteps retreating around the corner. Following the sound, I found myself on the main deck, the cold Atlantic air biting through my thin clothing. The night was clear, stars scattered across the black canvas above, the ship's lights creating a small island of illumination in the vast darkness. "Hello," I called, receiving only the constant rumble of the engines and the splash of waves against the hull in response. As I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye, a figure standing at the starboard rail, looking out to sea. One of the crew breaking protocol, I assumed, ready to issue a reprimand about proper watch procedures. "You there?" I called, approaching. "What's your name and station?" The figure didn't respond or turn. As I drew closer, I recognized the distinctive silhouette, broad shoulders, the slight stoop of Edward Brennan, who had been the Serena May's chief engineer during my previous command. But that was impossible. Brennan had died over a decade ago. Malcolm had mentioned it when we were catching up. A cloud passed over the moon, momentarily dimming the deck. When the light returned, the figure was gone. I stood frozen, heart pounding in my chest. I'm not a fanciful man. Decades at sea had taught me that most supernatural occurrences have perfectly rational explanations. Tricks of light, sleep deprivation, or the mind's tendency to impose familiar patterns on random stimuli. I told myself I'd seen a current crew member whose build reminded me of Brennan, nothing more. I returned to my cabin but found sleep elusive. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with faces from the past, crew members from my many voyages, their features blurring together as they moved about a ship that was somehow all vessels I'd ever commanded combined into one impossible architecture. I said nothing about the incident the next day. Malcolm noticed my fatigue but accepted my explanation of insomnia without question. We were entering the forecasted rough weather, and preparations kept us all busy. The Serena May pitched and rolled as waves grew to 15 feet, then 20. Nothing dangerous, but uncomfortable enough that several crew members succumbed to seasickness despite their experience. That night I took the bridge watch myself, allowing my regular officer some extra rest. The storm had intensified slightly, rain now pelting the windows as we pushed through the turbulent sea. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers and the glow of the instrument panels created a cocoon-like atmosphere, isolating me from the chaos outside. At just past midnight, the bridge door opened. I expected the night engineer coming to deliver his hourly report, but instead found myself looking at Malcolm. "Thought you might like some coffee," he said, holding out a steaming mug. I accepted it gratefully. "Couldn't sleep, not in this weather," he replied, settling into the chair beside mine. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two old sailors watching the angry sea. "Do you ever think about the Calliope incident?" Malcolm asked suddenly. I nearly spilled my coffee. The Calliope had been a small research vessel that the Serena May had encountered in distress during our time together. We'd responded to their mayday, but by the time we reached them, a rogue wave had capsized the vessel. We'd searched for survivors for 18 hours, finding only 2 of the 12-person crew alive. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Why do you ask?" Malcolm shrugged. "Just been on my mind lately. Wonder what happened to those we saved. The woman became an oceanographer, I believe. The man, I don't recall. Hanged himself 2 years later," Malcolm said flatly. "Survivor's guilt." I turned to look at him, disturbed by both the information and his tone. His profile in the dim light of the bridge seemed somehow different, older than he'd appeared in daylight, more haggard. "How do you know that?" I asked. "You hear things," he said vaguely. "Word gets around." Before I could press him further, the radio crackled with a weather update. By the time I'd acknowledged the transmission and made the necessary course adjustment, Malcolm had left the bridge. I didn't remember hearing the door open or close. The next morning brought calmer seas and a strange atmosphere among the crew. They performed their duties efficiently but spoke little, even during meals. When I entered a room, conversations would stop abruptly, resuming only after I'd left. I told myself it was the natural distance between captain and crew, perhaps amplified by my age and their awareness of my imminent retirement. I sought out Malcolm, finding him in the officers' mess reviewing charts. The men seemed quiet, I observed, pouring myself coffee. "Just focused on getting home," he replied without looking up. "This isn't exactly a pleasure cruise, and you seem different since we left Halifax." At this, he finally raised his eyes to mine. "Do I? How so?" I struggled to articulate what I meant, preoccupied. "Distant, just tired, Thomas. We're neither of us young men anymore." I couldn't argue with that, but something in his manner left me unsettled. As I turned to leave, I asked casually, "By the way, who's on engine room duty this shift?" "I need to discuss our fuel consumption." "Brennan's got it covered," Malcolm said, returning to his charts. The coffee mug nearly slipped from my fingers. "What did you say?" Malcolm looked up, brow furrowed. "I said Mercer has it covered." "Why?" I stared at him, certain of what I'd heard. "No, you said Brennan." "Brennan?" Malcolm's expression shifted to one of concern. "Thomas, Ed Brennan has been dead for 12 years. Heart attack in port at Singapore, remember?" "You sent flowers to his widow." I did remember. I'd been unable to attend the funeral due to being at sea, something I'd regretted. "Of course," I said, trying to sound normal. "I misheard you." Malcolm studied me for a moment too long. "Maybe you should get some rest. I can handle things for a few hours." "I'm fine," I insisted, though we both knew it wasn't true. That night I found myself unable to stay in my cabin. The walls seemed to close in, and every creak of the ship, sounds that normally lulled me to sleep, now set my nerves on edge. I dressed and began walking the ship's corridors, telling myself I was conducting a routine inspection. The Serena May was quiet, running smoothly through now calm seas. Most of the crew would be asleep, save for the essential watch personnel. I nodded to the few men I passed, who acknowledged me with appropriate respect if not warmth. My wanderings took me to the mess hall, deserted at this hour and dimly lit by safety lights. I was about to continue on when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of multiple voices and laughter coming from inside. I hesitated, then pushed open the door. The mess hall blazed with light, though I hadn't seen any illumination from the corridor. More shocking were the dozen men seated around the tables, playing cards, eating and drinking as if it were the middle of dinner service. I recognized every face, the full crew from my previous command of the Serena May, 23 years earlier. They didn't notice me at first. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching as Edward Brennan dealt cards to Michael Costes, our former radio operator who'd been killed in a car accident shortly after I left the ship. Across from them sat Lionel Patel, who'd suffered a fatal stroke 5 years ago according to maritime news I followed. And there, laughing at some joke, was young Samuel Webb, who'd been washed overboard during a storm in the North Sea in '97. Webb was the first to see me. He nudged Brennan, and gradually all conversation ceased as every head turned in my direction. "Captain Blackwood," Brennan said, rising from his seat. "We've been waiting for you to join us." "This isn't real," I said, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "Feels real enough to me," Costes replied, tapping his fingers on the table. The sound was unnervingly solid. "Have a seat, Captain, we saved you a place." Indeed, there was an empty chair at the head of the table, my chair from all those years ago. "You're all dead," I said bluntly, finding strength in stating the obvious truth. None of them seemed offended by this observation. If anything, they appeared amused. "Death's not quite what any of us expected," Patel said, his accented voice exactly as I remembered. "More of a reassignment, you might say." "I'm dreaming," I insisted, though I'd never had a dream this vivid, this coherent. "If it helps you to think so," Brennan nodded, "but you should sit, Thomas. We have things to discuss before we reach our destination." Against every rational instinct, I found myself moving toward the empty chair. As I sat, Webb poured me coffee from a pot that should have been empty at this hour. The liquid steamed in the mug, its aroma rich and inviting. "What destination?" I asked, not touching the coffee. "We're bound for Liverpool." The men exchanged glances that contained some private understanding. "Liverpool's just a waypoint," Brennan said gently. "You know that deep down." "I don't know what you're talking about," I insisted, though a cold dread was building in my stomach, and I don't know what kind of hallucination this is, but it needs to end. "It will," Costes assured me, "soon enough, but first we need to be certain you're ready." "Ready for what?" "To accept what happened," Webb said, his young face solemn. "What really happened to the Serena May?" I stood abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Nothing happened to this ship. She's old, being decommissioned. I'm delivering her to Liverpool where she'll be scrapped." "End of story. Is that what you believe?" Patel asked softly. "Or is that what you need to believe?" Before I could answer, the ship's emergency alarm blared through the speakers. The sound was deafening, piercing, and when I looked back at the table, all the men were gone. The mess hall was dark again, empty save for the standard furniture, no evidence of cards or coffee or ghostly crew members. I ran for the bridge, heart pounding. The alarm cut off abruptly mid-wail, which was even more disturbing than its activation. When I arrived, I found only the night officer, looking perplexed. "What happened?" I demanded. "Why was the alarm triggered?" He turned to me with confusion. "Sir, there was no alarm. I heard it clearly. The general emergency signal." The young officer shook his head. "All systems are normal, Captain. No alarms have sounded." "See for yourself." He gestured to the control panel where no warning lights were illuminated. I checked the ship's log, which would have automatically recorded any alarm activation. Nothing. According to every instrument and record, all was well aboard the Serena May. "Perhaps you were dreaming, sir," the officer suggested carefully. I didn't bother correcting him. How could I explain that I'd been wide awake, talking to dead men in the mess hall? Instead, I ordered him to conduct a complete systems check and retired to my cabin, though I knew sleep would be impossible. Dawn found me at my desk, reviewing the ship's original blueprints and crew manifests from my previous command. I'd kept copies of these documents out of sentimentality, never imagining they'd become tools in an investigation of the impossible. I compared the names on the old crew list with what I could find online about their subsequent careers and lives. The results were disturbing. Of the 20 men who had served under me in the '90s, 14 had died in the intervening years, a higher mortality rate than seemed statistically probable. Most deaths were attributed to natural causes or accidents, though 3 were suicides. The remaining 6 proved difficult to trace, as if they'd deliberately disappeared from public records. A knock at my door interrupted my research. It was Malcolm, looking concerned. "The men are talking," he said without preamble as he entered. "They say you've been wandering the ship at night, speaking to empty rooms." I considered denying it, but saw no point. "I've been experiencing something unusual, Malcolm, seeing things, or people rather." He sat heavily in the chair opposite my desk. "Who?" "The old crew. Brennan, Costes, Webb, Patel." "Others?" Malcolm's expression remained neutral, but I noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrests. "And what do these apparitions want?" "They seem to think I need to remember something about the Serena May. Something that happened, and do you remember anything unusual?" I studied my old friend's face, searching for some clue to his thoughts. Nothing beyond the ordinary challenges of any voyage. But they seemed convinced there was more. Malcolm was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Thomas, I'm worried about you. We're still 3 days from Liverpool. Maybe you should confine yourself to your cabin. Let me handle things until we dock. You think I'm having a breakdown. It wasn't a question. I think the stress of retirement, this final voyage, it could affect anyone. There's no shame in it, and if I refuse, will you relieve me of command? Malcolm sighed. Don't make this difficult. Get some rest. Doctor's orders. You're not a doctor, I pointed out. No, but I've seen enough men push to their limits to recognize the signs. He rose. I'll have meals sent to your cabin. Try to sleep. After he left, I sat motionless, considering my options. I could fight Malcolm's unofficial confinement order, but that would only convince the crew of my instability. Better to appear cooperative while continuing my investigation privately. I spent the day reviewing ship's logs from my previous command, looking for any incident that might explain the ghostly crew's cryptic comments. Nothing stood out. We'd had the usual mechanical issues, weather challenges, and minor personnel conflicts, but nothing catastrophic beyond the Calliope rescue, which had been well documented and, while tragic, was hardly a mystery. Night fell, and with it came a mounting sense of anticipation. I knew they would return, my dead crew, and this time I was determined to get answers. I didn't have to wait long. The temperature in my cabin dropped suddenly around midnight, my breath fogging in the air. The overhead light flickered, then stabilized at a lower intensity. When I turned from my desk, Edward Brennan stood by the door. You've been looking in the wrong places, Thomas, he said without preamble. Then tell me where to look, I replied, surprised by my own calmness. Not where, when. Brennan approached, stopping at the edge of my desk. Despite knowing he couldn't be corporeal, I could smell the familiar scent of machine oil and cigarettes that had always accompanied him. You need to remember October 17, 1996. The date meant nothing to me immediately. What happened then, that's what you need to remember. His form seemed to waver slightly, like heat distortion above hot pavement. The log won't help you. Some things were never recorded. Why not just tell me? I demanded, frustration breaking through my composure. Why these games? Because you have to accept it yourself. We can't force the truth on you. You have to recognize it. He looked genuinely regretful, but time is running short. The Serena May is reaching her final destination. Liverpool, I insisted. Brennan shook his head slowly. No, Thomas, not Liverpool. He glanced at the porthole, beyond which lay only darkness. Ask Malcolm about October 17. He remembers. Before I could respond, he was gone, not with any dramatic fade or spectral exit, but simply there one moment and not the next, leaving me alone in my suddenly warming cabin. October 17, 1996. I closed my eyes, trying to force the date to connect with some memory, some incident aboard the Serena May. Nothing came. According to my official records, we'd been mid-Atlantic, on a routine crossing with a full cargo. Weather unremarkable, no mechanical issues noted, a completely ordinary day. I waited until 2 a.m. before leaving my cabin, knowing Malcolm would be on the bridge for his watch. The corridors were quiet, the steady thrum of engines the only sound accompanying my footsteps. I encountered no one, living or dead, on my way. Malcolm was alone on the bridge, his profile silhouetted against the navigation instruments. He didn't seem surprised when I entered. Couldn't sleep, he asked without turning. October 17, 1996, I said directly. What happened that day? His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Just another day at sea. Why? Brennan seems to think differently. At this, Malcolm turned, his expression unreadable in the dim light. You're still seeing them then? Answer the question, Malcolm. What happened on October 17 that didn't make it into the log? He studied me for a long moment, then gestured to the captain's chair. Sit down, Thomas. I remained standing. I prefer to hear it on my feet. Malcolm sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years. October 17 was the day we hit the squall, Force 10 storm that came out of nowhere. The weather charts gave no warning. This didn't match my recollection at all. There was no storm. I would remember something like that. Would you? Malcolm's voice had an edge now. You were in your cabin with a fever of 103. Delirious, I was acting captain for 3 days while you were incapacitated. I shook my head, trying to reconcile this with my memories. That's not possible, I would have been told afterward. It would be in the medical log. Some things were kept from you, for your own good. Malcolm turned back to the instruments. The storm damaged the ship. We lost power for 6 hours, and we lost men. A cold sensation spread through my chest. How many? 3 washed overboard when a wave took out part of the starboard rail. 2 more died when flooding shorted out electrical systems in the lower decks. 7 injured, 2 critically. His voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion. We couldn't even recover the bodies. That's impossible, I whispered. I would have been notified when I recovered. There would have been investigations, reports. There were, but not with your name attached. Malcolm finally looked at me again. The company made a decision. You were 6 months from mandatory medical review. If it came out that you'd been seriously ill, failed to report symptoms, and were incapacitated during a crisis that resulted in fatalities, your career would have been over, so they covered it up and you went along with it. We all did, the surviving crew, the company executives. The official report listed the deaths as occurring during routine operations when unexpected severe weather struck. No mention of an incapacitated captain. You were allowed to believe you'd had a mild flu, nothing more. I felt sick, memories rearranging themselves in my mind. There had been crew changes after that voyage, men transferred to other vessels. I'd assumed it was normal rotation. And yes, I remembered being ill, but the details were foggy. Fever will do that. But to have lost 5 men under my command and not know it, it seemed inconceivable. Why tell me now? I asked. After all these years, Malcolm's laugh was without humor. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, Thomas. Deep down, that's why they're appearing to you, Brennan, Webb, all of them. Your conscience won't let you complete this voyage without facing the truth. But why now? Why this specific voyage? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was softer, almost gentle. Look at the ship's manifest, Thomas, the real one, not the paperwork you were given in Halifax. What are you talking about? I reviewed the manifest myself. Did you? Or did you see what you expected to see? He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, holding it out to me. Look, I took the paper, unfolding it under the light. It was indeed the Serena May's manifest, but the cargo listed was different from what I recalled. No mention of the machine parts and textiles I'd been told we were carrying. Instead, there was a single item. Hazardous waste for deep-sea disposal. This is illegal, I said, looking up at Malcolm. The company would never risk. The company went bankrupt 3 years ago, Thomas. The Serena May was sold for scrap then. The deck seemed to tilt under my feet, though the sea was calm. That's not possible. I received orders directly from Transocean Shipping. They contacted me about this final voyage. Did they? Or did you contact them? Malcolm's face showed only sadness now. Think, Thomas, really think about how this commission came about. I tried to remember the specifics, who had called whom, what exactly had been said. The details slipped away like water through my fingers. I remembered only the certainty that I was to captain the Serena May one last time. If what you're saying is true, I said slowly, then what is this ship? Who are these crew members? The ship is the Serena May, Malcolm replied. As for the crew, he glanced toward the bridge door. I think you already know. As if summoned by his words, the door opened. Edward Brennan entered, followed by Costes, Webb, Patel, and others. The full complement of men who had died during my years at sea, whether aboard the Serena May or other vessels I'd commanded. They formed a semicircle behind Malcolm, their expressions solemn but not unkind. It's time to complete the journey, Captain, Brennan said. We've reached the coordinates. What coordinates? I asked, though a terrible understanding was beginning to dawn. The same ones from October 17, 1996, Malcolm said, where the Serena May actually went down with all hands during the storm you don't remember. No, I shook my head violently. That's not possible. I lived years after that. I commanded other ships. I retired to Maine. I remember all of it. The mind creates what it needs to cope, Patel said gently. You crafted an entire life rather than accept what happened. We've been patient, Webb added. We all needed time to accept our fate, but now the ship has returned to where it belongs, and so have we, all of us. I backed away from them until I hit the bridge windows. Outside, the night had become unnaturally dark, no stars visible, no horizon distinguishing sea from sky, just perfect, absolute blackness. This isn't real, I insisted, though my conviction was faltering. I'm having some kind of breakdown, or this is an elaborate hoax. Look at your hands, Thomas, Malcolm said quietly. I glanced down and froze. My hands were transparent, the instruments of the bridge visible through them. As I watched in horror, the effect spread up my arms. What's happening to me? I whispered. Nothing is happening to you, Brennan said. You're simply finally seeing the truth. You died 27 years ago, Captain. We all did. And now it's time to stop running from that fact. The realization crashed over me like a physical wave, memories suddenly realigning, inconsistencies in my life after 1996 becoming obvious. The ease with which I'd secured subsequent commands despite my age, the way people sometimes seemed not to notice me in ports, the recurring dreams of drowning that had plagued me for decades. The company actually did try to dispose of toxic waste illegally, Malcolm explained, his own form now showing the same transparency as mine. That's what we were carrying when the storm hit. Perhaps that's why we've been held here. Unfinished business, and now, I asked, my voice sounding distant even to myself. Now we complete our journey, Brennan said, all of us together. The bridge around us began to dissolve, the solid walls and floor becoming insubstantial. Through them I could see the ocean floor far below, and resting on it, the broken, corroded remains of a ship I recognized despite its deteriorated state. The Serena May, my ship, my grave. As the last vestiges of the phantom vessel faded around us, I felt a profound sense of peace replace my fear. The weight of responsibility I'd carried for decades, responsibility I hadn't even known was there, lifted from my shoulders. "Ready, Captain?" Malcolm asked, extending his hand. I took it, finding it solid despite its spectral appearance. Around us, my crew waited expectantly. "Ready," I confirmed. "Let's go home." Together we descended toward the wreck, leaving behind the illusion of life I'd clung to for so long. As we approached the ocean floor, a light appeared in the distance, warm and welcoming, growing brighter with each moment. The Serena May had finally reached her destination, and so had I.